Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, one of my rare solo live streams. We tried this a few minutes ago, and the audio visual failed. So if there's a visual error, please comment. I was trying to point out the reason why I emphasize nominalism in regards to the definition of terms, and why I become so frustrated with the way we use a lot of these terms as political football, where we can project categories and emotional meanings onto the terms while actually defining them in inconsistent ways. I recently had a spat with Carl Bayer where I said that it was interesting to me to declare that the working class was won by the Democratic Party, and that this was a significant shift. And there's a 17 quote point shift upwards of people who voted over the 200,000 K mark for Republicans. And I said, well, there's a couple ways we can explain that. One is that's consistent with inflation, and if these people's income has also increased with inflation, we would expect a similar thing. But two, and more importantly, we're not really talking about classes here. We're talking about income brackets, or we're talking about classes as income brackets. Now, Carl has an issue with the way people have been using educational status as income, as a proxy for class status or even income status, and that's misleading. And that he says the right has been trying to do this. I pointed out that this has actually been a trend, going all the way back to Max Weber, to see your position in capital as tied to your cartelling. Cartelling of skills, etc. Now, one of the problems with social class is defined in a circular way. All right. A group of people within a society possesses the same socioeconomic status as a social class. Notice that actually uses what we're trying to define as the definition. Well, what's the socioeconomic status? Your social class. Well, what are the variables in which you're going to define that? Working class have been a football that a lot of different tendencies, whether the Republicans are Democratic Socialist or Marxist Leninist or me, often use without defining. And you'll often see people move between different definitions. Now, technically speaking, income is not a good proxy for what we mean by social class in Marxism, because social class is about your relationship to the means of production, whether or not you own capital, you work to help produce capital, or you work in something subsidiary to it. Now, there are problems with this definition of class 2, okay? And we get into that. So this sleight of hand goes all over the place. Carl said that I was being unfair to him because he was just backing up with the numbers. And I said, well, your numbers use sources, and the NBC poll in particular, that stop counting income brackets at 200,000. And even though you are making a valid point about not using education as a proxy for social class, what you are not doing is actually using a Marxist definition, right? Income, there's a bunch of different ways you can bring income in. This gets me to materialism, because materialism is a word that gets thrown around. Some people mean physicalism by it. By that, they mean physical infrastructure and the physical cost. Some people mean monism by it. They mean that there's a material substance of which everything is, that is monistically defined. Some people mean the way Marx and Engels meant by it is kind of structural relational emergence. So materialism includes social relations and relations of production. And why we are material is that the material in which we produce our world is a material which we care about, not some abstract idea. Those are all different definitions, and a lot of people use them the way Protestants talk about God, where one definition of God is actually not copacetic with another definition of God. It becomes non-cognitive, and all we have is an emotive meaning. All right. So materialism is often used that way too. And I'm often criticized for not being material enough, for going down to demographic, this or that, not talking about whatever X thing you think is the most important material variable. All of it's important material variables, which is why I talk about all of it. So when people talk about how this may seem undisciplined, I'm actually trying to give you multiple big pictures. So to defend Carl a bit, and I think it is often good to defend people that you've started a fight with a little bit, is Carl didn't misrepresent the stats. He did not his sources say what he said they said. It's just that the stats themselves, when disaggregated in that way, bracket out part of the picture. And if you follow it, if you follow precinct data, if you follow prior income data that goes way up into the millions on post on voting surveys and exit polls, you see that there is a interesting and weird sleight of hand in the Democratic electoral base. Since the 1930s, people in the lower income brackets have voted for Democrats. Since probably the 1970s, different sectors of the rich have voted for Democrats. If you are on the East and West Coast and make more than $500,000 a year, you are 60% more likely to be a Democrat than a Republican. But in general, if you are well off, you're more likely to be a Republican. That also is because we're dealing with different scales of numbers. And admittedly, I know a lot of people take advantage of the fact that it's very hard to understand scales of numbers. For example, the DSA is a mass organization. Well, according to its official numbers, it has about 62,000 members, and that's mostly paper members, but whatever. Those are real members in good standing. But remember that you're in a country of 350 million when you talk about the DSA. Now, yes, most left-wing sectarian groups traditionally don't get past 5,000, and that's been a kind of hard set number since the 1950s. Don't know why. I don't have a good reason for why that is the case, but it is the case. So we play sleight of hand on things like working class, our materialism. All right. And a lot of times we use some of the stuff to distract from other questions, like, what are we supposed to do now that the Democrats seemingly have defeated part of Trumpism, although Trump is not going away anytime soon? I mean, that's already happened, right? And there is a perverse incentive structure for media and also Democrats to keep you concerned about Trump, since, frankly, even the exit polls back this up, negative partisanship specifically against Trump is mostly what they are using to keep you loyal as a voting bloc if you vote for Democrats. This is a trick, right? We project things onto other things. The working class right now is a political football because people realize the social inequity, both in terms of income and in terms of production and power. All right. And they are related, but not the same thing. Is really weighing down on all parts of society, and who they think the enemies are and why they think they are the way they are and who they even is does vary depending on where in the country you are, what the dominant industries are in that area, what racial and gender demographic you're talking about, etc., etc. Don't use the working class like the way people use God to project that there's a large body of people who automatically think like you and that you are winning or you're representing something, right? When Carl Bayer says that the Democrats won the working class, we don't even know, because that the poll work hasn't been done yet, for us to really know the amount of working class people who voted. Some of these elections have not even been called. So again, if you wanted to say that lower income people who voted more for Democrats, you would both be factually true and also quite useful. Right? But if you want to say that the Democrats won the working class and you don't define that category, or you define that category based off income, okay, you're actually defining working class as part of your purchasing power, not as your relation to production, because that's what that means. It's a consumptivist model. It's a consumer model of power. Now, often we have to use income data as a proxy for it, but it should be one proxy of many when you talk. Because both the Democrats and Republicans have incentives to have you misunderstand the words they're using, and journalists have no incentive to clarify. Now, I've also been pointing out that in this talk here, we have to do a whole lot of things to parse what we meant. So we need to really think about what has this working class politics been used to do, right? My thesis since 2018 is that this has effectively been a control opposition for the status quo, but many people respond to that by tailing right-wingers. And that what the right-wing actual definition here of class, and they're also using misleading, is education and other functions, so that they can go out and pretend that they aren't. A lot of them don't want to be conservatives because movement conservatism, despite having a generation and a half dominance on the American political scene, is highly unpopular amongst the young. But you can get young people to have similar attitudes by rebranding it. We've rendered most of this meaningless. A lot of the people on the right and a lot of their allies on the left have been repeating these talking points without realizing it. And I'll give Carl another piece of credit because he's actually trying to push back against this. Is that there's an administrative state thesis that somehow the middle managers of capital run everything. Now, even people like Michael Lind, who's not a Marxist, not a leftist at all, point out that this is absurd, that they believe that what politics is that there's a political battle between the petite bourgeoisie, i.e. the small property holders, and professionals. He doesn't actually believe in the PM thesis, although a lot of people who like the PM thesis use him. But they don't believe, in fact, they say explicitly that the working class is kind of an emotive force that one elite or another will just funnel into their political needs. Now, notice we're playing with weird definitions of what working class is. Notice that we're playing with weird definitions of what professional managerial class is. These things are used to obscure things. There's a reason why a lot of the former right-wingers in my life, or current right-wingers in my life, like this language. But when you actually ask people what it is, it's always moving around. The exact relationship to capital is always moving around. The who the working class is always moving around. Fundamentally, a lot of these debates are about branding, and that is it. I got asked by someone I used to respect, maybe still do, I'm unsure, why I wasn't talking more about the hydrocarbon cartel in the Democratic Party and Republican Party, which we spent 2 hours on in the John Michael Colon episode. It's funny because people take you talking about anything and trying to give a big picture as you not talking about what they want you to talk about, which is what they think the most pertinent variable of material relation are. And yes, everyone should realize that if the ecology fails, that is the primary source of our wealth. Marx says that, not value, not labor power, the actual physical world. Labor power enables us to valorize it. Value enables us to abstract it. But you eat based off of stuff coming from the earth. I think most of these politics are a distraction for that, but most of the critique of people talking about this politics are also a distraction from the fact people have no program and no reality for how to feed people while cutting down on nitrogen use and cutting electricity. And who's going to take the payoff? And how are you going to avoid the violence of that payoff? Understanding the social groups and the way people are using this language to get you tied in one knot or another is a good way to also make it seem like we're critiquing something that we have no real program on how to fix. I've pointed out that even if they were like, well, mass die-off might save it. If 80% of the population died off, then we wouldn't have global warming anymore. And actually, at this point, that is not necessarily scientifically clear. Carbon feedback loops actually means that we have to remove carbon from the atmosphere and fundamentally change the way we use and expend power to do that. And we have not, as of yet, come up with any power source other than nuclear power that is as energy dense to energy it takes out to replace hydrocarbons. That's just also a fundamental truth. If that depresses you, and it probably should, this is why we talk about radically decomplexifying society, why we still have the resources to do that without collapse. But if you read Joseph Tainter, the odds are not in our favor and never have been. But no politician, and frankly, very few Marxists, are going to want to sit down and tell you what that means. Because there's two ways. We can either continue on the way things are and the capitalists are right, and we will develop a way to deal with this problem. Well, nuclear power is threatened by a lot of things. It's threatened by drought. It's threatened by the limited amounts of nuclear reactive core materials. It's threatened by the fact that while there are definitely on spec some small technologies you can use to handle nuclear, that they have not been implemented anywhere enough for us to really know if they're going to deal with the heat-sink problems. There's a lot of issues. I could recommend people read William Vollmann's 2 massive books on carbon in the future. All right. And as well as Climate Leviathan by Joel Wainwright and what's his face. You have to deal with a change of energy consumption. You have to deal with the change in fundamental productive capacity. You have to deal with the fact that we wasted a lot of this production on garbage. All right. And you can't undo that waste. I don't mean to sound like a doomer because I'm not, but I do think people need to realize how serious this is. And yes, there's a lot of times where we're playing political football, so you aren't dealing with it. But there's also a real sense that everyone involved, including most of the quote left, has an incentive for you not to look at these things. Because their immediate political trajectories, as much as they might really care and really want to change the environment, often does not have a good and viable answer to this question. And believe it or not, I don't think the Green New Deal was ever sufficient. And even if you get an answer to one of these questions, so for example, let's take the Green New Deal as sufficient, you get with another. Well, if we accept your that we can fund this off of currency generating, credit generating exchange, generating more production, and that production being clean as opposed to unclean as a policy value, as many MMT inspired people argue. Then you have to ask yourself a question. Well, what's the fundamental power relation that would allow anyone to do that? Like, why would there be no political incentive for someone on the center left or left to actually be able to do that? Do you think that, I got a question. What do you think of the EU's Green New Deal from Dim 25? Seems more serious. They can't do it. The EU's current trajectory has been based off of outsourcing its carbon production to Russia. As that's ended because of the Ukraine-Russia situation, the flaws in their ability to build up their quote renewable capacity have been absolutely exposed. So yes, they have a serious plan of which they're not actually really committed to doing. And that becomes clear in so many of these. I mean, in the United States, we're even more further off from that. No. Ask yourselves who's been benefiting from you believing in these concepts and parasocial gains. I am one of them. Not going to lie about that. The difference between me and a lot of other people is I'm pretty upfront about it. The last few months, I've been dealing with people fighting over which millionaire and alternative media that they're going to side behind, all of whom are downstream of legacy media, all of whom are trained for legacy media, and all of whom I've gotten closer and closer to the longer that I've been in this. And all of it's based on a social media infrastructure that is fundamentally incompatible. And when I'm pointed out that that's incompatibility seems tied partly to the ubiquity of phones, a real physical commodity, but also partly to, and more importantly, in some ways, to the fact that there's been all this investment that has had nowhere to go because there's been tons of money floating in the economy. And that money's being pulled out by interest rates. And that a lot of investments were made safe. I don't know how they were made safe, because I also have been convinced that QE was not actually creating money through backdoor, but often just capturing toxic assets. But it was capturing toxic assets, and now those toxic assets and like things like social media are exposed. We're watching company after company really begin to crack, and they're making irrational moves to try to stay relevant because they never really had a product that made sense in the first place. Apple, of the great media company, seems to be the one doing the best, and it's because of two reasons. One, its security infrastructure has actually messed with a lot of the other social media giants, but two, it deals in physical commodities. Physical commodities that tie you into rent systems and current ecosystems that has the best of both worlds, but it does. These are the kinds of material things I want people to look at. Whether or not the working class is won by the Democrats, which is not a question that I think even really makes sense with the kind of data we can get from exit polls, is not a question that's particularly useful. I mean, I guess it's useful to disprove what Republicans are claiming, but that should not be the main ball on the court. And on that note, we need to step back. The question I'm going to ask all of you is, and it's a question I've asked over and over and over again. Last night when we talked about the midterms, I said, interestingly, the emergence of democratic socialism amongst the young and the emergence of a youth voting bloc, both in later millennials and now in Zoomers, has actually not that fundamentally changed the traditional voting patterns. Like what we saw yesterday or in last week is that what would be normally categorized as a loss because it wasn't a major loss is now being categorized as a win. Democrats are most likely still going to lose the House. They're either going to tread water or lose one seat, but not let Republicans take dominance in the Senate. They gained, I think, 3 governorships, but most of which in areas that are traditionally pretty left-leaning anyway, etc. All right. But what does that change when I'm talking about these larger picture issues? And the answer is not a lot. Like, it's stopping the worst from happening, and that's it. And I'm not even sure it really is stopping the worst from happening. It's buying maybe a little bit of time. And if your question is, should you join the Democratic Socialist of America or whatnot, I can't answer that for you. All right. I can tell you that their membership is declining, and I can tell you that they are more formally wedded to the Democratic Party than they've ever been. But I can also tell you that every other group that I know of has also begun to shrink and collapse in the past 2 years too. That one of the ironies, and it's an irony that was totally predictable if you followed what happened with the far right in the Trump administration, is, and I've literally talked about this since 2017. That most of these oppositional political movements, they tend to emerge in opposition to the party that they seem close to, define themselves as opposition to the other party of politics, and then die fairly quickly or become normalized and part of the normal apparatus fairly quickly to the mainstream of the party that they were initially an internal critique of. Sometimes they have a massive effect on policy, sometimes they don't, but they never have what they initially advocated for. And this is a trend that goes back to literally the 1940s. Like, we're looking at 4 generations of this, 5 generations of this almost. Do you want to be part of that? Well, where else are you going to go? But then you have to admit, you didn't really have an alternative project. Anyway, I have to record nothing and answer a phone call from somebody. I think we're going to see a lot of people who've claimed to be social democrats or democratic socialists. I know they get really pissy when you call them social democrats, just like Stalinists get really pissy when you call them Stalinist. It's one of the great ironies of the left is how many people don't want you to call them what they actually are. I think we're going to see a lot of people just cut one way or the other into conventional politics. But all the problems fundamentally in America and in most of the developed world are going to stay the same because they're larger than the political football game. And very few people have any incentive, and they won't build a big audience to actually fix it. Right? Like, I don't doubt. Here's one of the funny things. I think every faction in this is sincere. I don't think they're cynical. I mean, I think the upper echelons of all these movements may be cynical, but the average person arguing for this or that is not cynical. They're not trying to mess with the definition of working class. They're not trying to make materialism meaningless. That's not the point. But a function of something is what it actually does. Look at what this has done. We don't have an alternative to the Democratic Party. We have reinvented the progressive movement of the 1990s. Just called it socialist this time. We moved the Overton window, but changed politics very, very little. Which tells you how much moving the Overton window actually mattered, doesn't it? I once got people mad because I talked about how one side of the other were both tailist, or hitching their wagon to different factions, as my friend Jeremy wants me to do. He doesn't like me using old Leninist language, but it is true. There's not just that they were both tailists; they're both tailists to different elements of someone to the right of the positions of the people who thought that they were finding something radical from them. And it's always in what they don't say and what they don't define that tells you this. Yeah, as Eric says in the chat, Overton Window rules us. In United States of America, Overton window moves you. And we render these terms meaningless by continuing to engage in them in this way. But it's hard not to engage. I do think you could critique some of my election coverage as giving too much to normal bourgeois politics. But I've also said that if you pretend that politics is everywhere but the political, then what do you got? If politics is not where the men with guns are and who controls them and who you elect to control them, then well, there's politics. Where's the real movement? It's always elsewhere. It's always not what you're doing. Where's organizing? Well, you should organize this, but we're not going to look at the real trend. Well, where the unions are a problem. Yeah, they are. And what do you do with it? We start new unions, but not everyone can do that. And not everyone's interested in doing that because they know how much of a waste of time it is and how risky it is if they don't succeed. On one hand, you have a very small minority of people who are using social democratic and democratic socialist language so that they can distance themselves from the fact that they've essentially taken conservative positions from 20, 30 years ago, but don't want to look like the ill-fitting Brooks Brothers suit aesthetics and don't want to admit that they just want a different part of the quote professional managerial strata to actually rule, one that looks more like them and has their similar values that they don't want to admit would be wearing a 90s ill-fitting Brooks Brothers suit. On the other hand, you have a bunch of people who don't want to admit that they're basically just plain old fucking progressive Democrats. That the illusion of movement in that field was important to them, but now that it is over, what are you going to do? You can wag your head and go, well, these centrists are liberals, but what are you? Because you have essentially helped those centrists stay in power. Because why? Well, you're afraid of the right. The right has the same logic. I've been on it. The whole argument of the entire time of the Reagan coalition of movement conservatism was that the scary communists were going to take over both externally and internally. And the libertarians, the developmental conservatives in the Sun Belt, maybe even some neo-Confederates here and there, and the moral majority needed to shut up on their differences to maintain the center-right against the communists. What do you think happened to them? They dominated American politics for 40 years, but it took 9/11 and the seeming coronation of 9/11 to completely destroy them. And it's funny because we see this again and again and again. People think they get what they want and it destroys them. as oppositional movements because they never had their own political movement. They never had their own political goals. They never understood what their goals were. They were just in opposition to something else. And the moment they achieve that, they can be nothing. Yes, because Socialist Alternative literally spends all the thousands of his cadre resources on keeping two candidates in statewide elections. Again, this is because you're not looking at scale. I like Kasama Sawat. All right. But the moment the assault won with Kasama Sawat and also tried to reinforce its own internal line, it went from growing, like the DSA was growing after it, to being about 1,000 people. I have a reputation for being a doomer because I just try to tell you guys that so much of what you're caught up in doesn't benefit you. It benefits someone else. Swama Sawat. I know. As Trotskyism continues to collapse around us, we must make sure that our two state level, municipal level candidates who have to barely fend off multi-million multi-million-dollar campaigns against them. I mean, to be fair, like it makes total sense, right? Like this is not Sawant's problem. Like this is not her failure at all. This is a structural problem. And it's because a lot of these groups are trying to build electoral apparatuses before they even have their own social and organizational apparatuses really completed. And I'll give Sawant and Salt one credit. At least they tried to build it at a level where you actually can maybe succeed, as opposed to jumping immediately to the executive of the United States. But the problem remains that if you don't build everything else, you get stuck just defending that one. You're not even stuck defending policies. You're defending one or two candidates constantly. Doesn't matter. I mean, I think as far as elected politicians in the United States, Sawant is one of the most sincere. Doesn't really change what I'm saying. I don't think Bernie was a sellout. I always thought the Bernie mission was structurally impossible. I know that's like the most damning thing I can say, and to a lot of people, and a lot of people who are my friends, but it's true. What would have happened if Bernie won? Salt, yeah, and so has the CPUSA, so has this and the other. There's lots of groups dumping money into Amazon and Starbucks workers. By the way, despite this whole uptick in workers stuff, has anyone been looking at the aggregate numbers of unions that have been successful? Only new unions in relatively marginal areas, and they're getting their ass kicked. Now, it's clearly scaring parts of the powers that be. So, I mean, something's going on, right? But the larger trends are actually being obscured by this, too. Citizens United is a major problem, but I think it's kind of funny that that we think Europe or these other countries that have slightly better legal systems are able to do much more than this. I mean, look at fucking England right now. What do you see? Yeah, you've got to start somewhere, is how I've heard people wasting their time literally for longer than any of you have been alive. Blah, 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 blah. No one expects a revolution to come tomorrow. This is a long fight. We're going to do it one municipal dog catcher at a time, right? That we've been saying that since the 1940s. What's your better ideas then? I've told you, you need to build larger social bases before you even try to take electoral politics, which is what happened with the SPD for literally 50 years. So if you guys actually studied the history instead of trying to jump to the part that's sexy and romantic, you would know, but you don't. Because you don't have the capacity to do it. Yes, what we need is another children's crusade. I'm not going to move to where you are, to one of the most expensive municipalities in the country, to help you do something in an area where, objectively speaking, you're not dealing with some of the poorest people in the first place. I mean, it is interesting to me, and it does actually betray a whole lot, that we're only able to pull this off in relatively rich municipalities, whereas there's real stuff going on in the industrial heartland of the country that people aren't even looking at. And it isn't sexy, and it isn't fun, and it's not where you're focused on, because most of these organizations rely on students. And then when they age out, those people become cadre members until they're mid-30s, and they either have families and fall away, or since so many of us can't afford to these days, they continue in their own weird activist way. I'm in a union, you dipshit. Say it to my face and you pull back a nub, at best. One does not conflate one's organizing capacity with one's media. Yeah, you're 50. Good. No, you insulted my honor. And it either betrays that you are not socially aware because you're a 50-year-old man by your own admission. I shouldn't assume your gender. You're a 50-year-old person by your own admission. Talking to someone who will warn you very strongly that you have to be careful how you address me. Not because I'm better than you, because we're equal. And I would not insult your honor. I do not say that you aren't doing anything. But I've been scapegoated and called into all kinds of campaigns by people that ended up using up a ton of my energy that I could have used to actually help people elsewhere to keep a candidate in power. A candidate who, even if they're sincere, can't do that much. And then when I pull that out, I get the same shit I get from everybody. The same shit you actually get from Democrats too. That, well, why aren't you doing more if you just, yeah, I don't play that game. My honor is so much more important than the working class. You don't lie to yourself about what you achieve, my friend. No, I said that if you'd have said it to my face, I would have fought you. I didn't challenge you to a physical fight. I mean, you are welcome to say it to my face and come down here. This is why I don't do a lot of the streams, actually, because this is what happened. I hit on something that someone has a lot of prior investment in because they're putting a lot of work into it. Right? You are. Right? Yes, I'm all about my own ego because I happen to be a human being and not a fucking activist robot, right? Right? No, I'm talking about how people are literally using you to build their political careers or their media careers and nothing else, and using categories to do that. And that most of this ends up going to support the Democrats. And your counterexample was two small scale politicians who've not been able to scale up, which is what I talked about in the beginning. Now, if you want to talk about what I actually do, I don't talk about that on air. So you're not doing anything by complaining on media. I never said I was building socialism by complaining on media. I'm pointing out how people are wasting your fucking time. You're exactly the thing I'm talking about. A 50-year-old person who's devoted a whole bunch of their life into what became a struggle to keep one candidate in office, maybe two, and to help other people who've really done a lot more than what SALT can do, because SALT's only 1,000 people. Um, to build unions, which are being crushed right now by millionaires. And you're telling someone who's literally a union activist and whatnot that I'm not doing it because I'm not talking about it on air. Talking about it on air would be my fucking ego. You're attacking me personally because I didn't agree with you. And I said that the way you were doing it was particularly Val, and it does involve an honor response. And then you say I care about my honor more than about the working class. Fuck you, dude. To what have I dedicated my life? No, I said if you said that to my face, you would have pulled back on that, which is true. Because that's the kind of thing that people don't do in person. All right? Most people say these things because it's easy to be brave behind a camera or in a chat. I've dedicated my fights to picking fights online. Okay. Okay. You know what? This is why I don't do a lot of live stream shows. You're not welcome here anymore. Don't engage. I blocked him. This was a waste of fucking time. You know what? If I had $1 for every activist who literally spent their life talking about how they were organizing, and they're in their 50s and 60s, and they can barely hold on to anything, and they say the same shit that I've heard for 40 years. And then when they insult me and don't realize they've done it by asking, by doing the same kind of social blackmail that other people do, and then ask me to out what I do as if I needed to recount to you that I have a life outside of that, as a public school teacher, as a union rep, as a person who actually literally helped stop the building of a prison here. Yeah. No, I normally ignore them. That's why I don't do these live streams. Right? Because they're kind of a waste of time. You always get someone who's invested a lot of their life. Like, I've dealt with that guy before on mine, and he's been mostly fine. But I hit where he's invested his life, which is insult. And you knew it because the first thing he did was make a big deal out of me mispronouncing Swama Sawat's name the way it is normally mispronounced. And we went from there. SALT had a chance to actually be a pretty big organization, and it's been declining in number since all it can do is defend these small electoral gains and then invest a lot of issues on other people's unionization movements, which is what you should do. But I think it's funny that if you have any personal integrity at all when you deal with these people, or you get mad when someone insults you, that they immediately go, well, you clearly don't care about the working class. You only care about your own ego. The same thing could be said about someone who devoted a lot of their life to a strategy that doesn't work, that you're doing it to assuage your own sense of changing the world when you're not having that much effect at all. And particularly when it's like, oh, well, let's all move to Seattle, which I said is an incredibly rich city. Like, if let's make the Soviet Union happen by all moving to California. You know what? I think a lot about what my job is here, about what I'm trying to do. And I'm often stuck with the attitude that maybe I should just stop. So I'm going to stop.
ضخم تبدو آثاره الانفجار الثاني وانفجارات كبيرة وهائلة، وربما هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of security and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Well, you think our country's